Hello and welcome to the NLA webinar series. Big warm welcome to you for today's session, which is called Putting Design at the Heart of Public Transport Infrastructure, which is part of the Transport and Infrastructure Programme at NLA. My name is Sue Morgan. I'm the Executive Director at Design Council and I'll be moderating the session today. Thank you to the programme champions of the event, Network Rail and Transport for London in association with Design Council. And thank you, the audience, for joining us today. So before we get started, I've just got a few words on housekeeping. The event's going to run for about an hour or so, and we'll have a panel discussion with some time at the end for Q&A. If you do have any questions, please put them into the Q&A box and we'll do our best to get through them. If we can't get through them, we'll sort of pull them together, scoop them up into some report at the end. There will be an evaluation survey at the end, so hang around when the event is finished so that you can populate that survey. And the event is being recorded today and you'll be able to get access to that from the NLA. If you want to use social media to talk about the event, please use hashtag NLA, capital letters, infrastructure. But also in reference to the panel, there's at Living Streets, at Design Council, at Network Rail, at TfL, and at EXP capitals _ENG. So without further ado, I want to get on with the session with just a little bit of scene setting and context. I'll ask the panel to introduce themselves in a little while, but in advance to that, I'm really pleased to say that we're fortunate to have such an illustrious panel today. Mary Cree, CEO of Living Streets, Judith Sykes, Director of Expedition Engineering, Anthony Dure, Professional Head of Buildings and Architecture at Network Rail Property, Peter Elliott, Head of Property Development at TfL, and Sir Peter Hendy, Chair of Network Rail. And just as a little way of introducing myself and Design Council, before we go on to the panel discussion, Design Council was set up in 1944 by Churchill's government to support post-war recovery, providing design advice and support for emerging and new industries. Flash forward today with the COVID world, and we see many parallels in the work that we're doing at Design Council at the moment. Design Councils provide strategic design advice and support, offers insights and world-leading research to support our mission, making life better by design. We work in business innovation, social innovation, and architectural built environment, and we do this through a strategic lens of sustainable living, design skills, and health and well-being. And in relevance to this session, we've worked on setting design principles and standards for organisations responsible for rail, road, air, communities, and customers, private, public, and public sectors. On the notion of value, which I think is important for the context of this conversation, we must all recognise that now is a moment when we can see that the notion of value is being looked at and examined with a different lens by governments and industry globally as well as nationally. I can point recently to Mark Carney's Reith lectures on value, Mariana Mazzucato at the UCL work on value through our academic studies and publication of the value of everything. Closer to the transport sectors and this conversation, National Infrastructure Commission have been doing research on the value of the quality of life. UK Green Building Council have been working on the value of green infrastructure. Flora Samuels at Reading University has been looking at social value, and Design Council are working currently on our own value of social and environmental design in our research publication Design Economy 21, which will be coming out next year. And of course, we've got COP26 this year. And I think in the new world paradigm where COVID, climate, and credit are at the foremost of our minds, how we design, its impacts and outcomes absolutely affects us all. So good design contributes not only to award-winning materiality, the substance of places, transport networks, etc., but can and should create the conditions for good health and well-being, resilience, reducing carbon and addressing biodiversity loss. So how can we demonstrate or reset the conversation that design, its social and environmental value, which is hard to quantify, needs to be front and centre of delivery and development and the wider supply chain. So that's my bit of scene setting, context for you all to get you thinking. So what I'd like to do now is just ask the panel to briefly introduce themselves, what they do at the organisation, and then just give a sort of response, I guess, to my context setting about how do you put design at the heart of what you do, and then we'll open up for some further questions. So if I can start with Mary, go on to Judith, Anthony, Peter, and if I can end with Sir Peter, that would be fantastic. So Mary, over to you.
Thanks very much indeed for that, Sue. I'm Mary Cray. I'm the Chief Executive of Living Streets. We were formerly set up as the Pedestrian Association in 1929 to lobby and campaign for the rights of pedestrians to be seen and acknowledged and kept safe on streets. And we were behind the world's first zebra crossing in the 1960s. And also we've had a huge input into government design and the very active debate that there is at the moment on walking and cycling. I think what we're seeing in our cities now, and COVID has exposed and exacerbated inequalities, is the results of a legacy where in post-war design, road traffic, cities were designed around traffic, not around people. And as someone who grew up in Coventry in the 60s and 70s with the famous Ring Road and the pedestrianised centre, I saw it and I lived it and I breathed it firsthand. We know that when you design out pedestrians, you end up with crime-ridden subways, you end up with streets that are too hot to walk on, you end up with parking, air pollution, and of course the huge carbon emissions that come from motorised traffic, which have not fallen over the last 15 years. So we are very keen to reposit humans at the centre of our cities. And that means designing around desire lines. It means designing for social inclusion. That means that the voices of children and the voices of older people must be heard. That means designing places where people can rest and where people can meet. It means designing for nature, to include nature rather than to exclude nature. So the inclusion of trees and plants gives you not just shade, but also shelter. And finally, and perhaps more difficult, to design around curiosity, play and creativity. What happens when you reallocate space away from cars and towards people? And I think COVID has shown us that, you know, as humans, we are animals, we are social beings. And as we all sit in our little boxes communicating on Zoom, what wouldn't we give for a place where we could meet and play? What happens when we take away parking and put in parklets? What we know is that when you design for pedestrians, Nike at Oxford Circus, when the new crossing was put in, the X crossing at Oxford Circus, so instead of crossing in 2 stages, you crossed in 1 stage, Nike's profits increased by 25%. When you take the cars off the shopping streets, you create space for pedestrians. And we know that footfall and spend can go up by 30%. And we've done some work on that with the pedestrian pound. Finally, I think just on design, I'm sure we'll hear about the macro part of design, the kind of trying to avoid urban sprawl, suburban sprawl, places that are difficult to connect without a car. We'll hear about it at the meso level, at street level, but we also need to think about it at the micro level. What is underfoot? Are our cities and towns and villages truly inclusive? And the research that has been replicated, not just in California, but here in the UK, shows that the more cars you have, the fewer friends you have. So design for sociability and designing cities where people can move, can breathe, can meet and can see their friends is the heart of what we do through our work with community street audits, working with schools and working with older people to make sure that people stay connected. So I'll leave it there and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mary. I'm going to pass over to Judith, and I do say I like curiosity, play, social inclusion, and then we take that sort of hard edge of health and safety and engineering, and then some in the middle, come in the middle. Judith, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Sue. So I'm Judith Sykes, the Director of Expedition, where I lead on the sort of infrastructure and sustainability planning for our sort of major projects. And a substantial amount of my work is with local authorities and infrastructure clients on responding to the climate and biodiversity emergency. Alongside Anthony, I'm also a member of the National Infrastructure Commission's design group, which published the design principles of people, climate, place and value last year. And I'm now working with the Institution of Civil Engineers on a sort of skills and knowledge programme to support the development of design champions in our sector. And we also published a report last year about how you can create social value, greater social value in infrastructure projects as well. So to the question about how I approach design in the work that I do, I think there's probably three very pragmatic approaches that I take. And the first is, you know, often design is a misunderstood word, and I think really what I try and focus on is the outcomes that you're trying to deliver in placemaking and infrastructure delivery, and that's why the sort of design principles are so helpful. Because I think if you are able to place infrastructure investment in the context of environmental and social value, that you are able to build much better public support for those projects, but also give a very clear steer to teams working on those projects about what it is that we can deliver. The second component is sort of builds very much on what Mary has been saying about engaging broad perspectives. So that includes working with communities to understand local needs, but also bringing in expertise and different design disciplines and through to the supply chain as well. And often my work, or going into sort of different organisations, if you're able to break down the sort of silos that exist in those organisations, that's where you get real innovation. You get different partners coming together to resolve a problem. I think that's when you can get really great outcomes. And then the sort of third component is in challenging and reframing the brief. You know, what is the question that we're really trying to answer as part of our infrastructure investment? And I suppose if I was to draw on a sort of example of how we've put that into action, a lot of my work is around how you build communities and places on the back of infrastructure investment. And one of the projects that we worked on a couple of years ago now, but it has evolved since we won the competition, is the VeloCity project, which was a response to the National Infrastructure Commission's call for ideas for placemaking in the Oxford to Cambridge corridor. So, you know, the ambition to build 1 million homes in that corridor on the back of investment in road and rail infrastructure. And the VeloCity proposal was very much a response to how do you link up the smaller settlements and grow the smaller settlements in those areas with a really good cycling network, as the name would suggest. And that's because we were really concerned about the investment of and growth in that area and the impact that it would have on those communities, particularly in relation to cars. Again, sort of the point that Mary made about concern about sprawl as well, associated with that investment. And so we created these new communities with excellent cycling networks that connect to stations along East-West Rail. And in doing so, you know, part of the work that we did was to be able to demonstrate how much land could be released if you don't design for cars, and then how that enables you to deliver affordable communities, affordable housing, and create space for people and for wildlife, and that provides you a quality of life in those areas, and is able to, and in turn, to attract the talent that you want to into that knowledge to that knowledge corridor. That was a couple of years ago, and I think at the time, you know, everybody looked at us slightly squiffy, you know, that we were advocating development within these corridors. But I think post-COVID, everything that we had said at that time about quality of life, access to green space, responding to sort of trends in remote working and different ways of working has really accelerated, and some of the sort of downsides of COVID, and we've seen that sort of inaccessibility to green space as well, has really put Velocity, really at the heart of some of these conversations. And we're now working with Blenheim Palace and a couple of other authorities to sort of deliver that in practice.
Thank you, Judith. That's super interesting, and I think, yeah, creating the conditions for connectivity and active travel, and also understanding that we have that moment. As a landscape architect, as by training, it's so nice to see it's a moment. Can I ask Anthony next to introduce himself and reflect on sort of design in Network Rail?
Thank you, Sue. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Anthony Dewar. I'm the Professional Head of Buildings and Architecture at Network Rail. So I think infrastructure, the industry as a whole, has historically had a tendency to almost forget its purpose. So we're really passionate that infrastructure is there for people. So in the case of rail, that's allowed people to travel or to trade, or for us to move goods on the network. And so we've been working really hard to put design at the heart of what we do in Network Rail's built-in environment. And we're doing this in three key ways, really. A top-down approach. So in 2018, we published Network Rail's Principles of Good Design, where we published 9 high-level principles that we would expect to see in all of Network Rail's built environment work. And we've recently just updated those to include a 10th principle. We've hardwired those principles into our Network Rail engineering, architectural, and other assurance standards, so that within Network Rail and our supply chain, those principles become embedded in what we do within the built environment. In a bottom-up approach, we're about a third of the way through a whole program of work that Frank Anatol and my team is leading on, to develop a suite of new design guidance. And that design guidance sets our minimum expected levels of what we expect in our built environment, what we consider good looks like. So it gives examples of what good looks like in, for example, master planning, public toilets, footbridges and subways, and inclusive design. And then the third area where we've been working really, really hard is to work collaboratively. So rather than be very inward looking, to be very outward looking, working with industry experts, working with a design council who's provided us strategic design advice. The design council run our design panel for us. And we run a number of design competitions with the RIBA, which is the first time in generations that as Network Rail or our predecessor organisation, we've run design competitions. The first significant one that we undertook was a footbridge design competition. That has resulted in us to completely reinvigorating the way we approach station footbridges. We've got a whole new catalogue of station footbridge designs, and we're in the process of undertaking significant research and development work into 2 new types of footbridge that will put us at the cutting edge of either material design or manufacturing techniques as we try to aim towards Industry 4.0. We're also about a third of the way through a significant competition looking at stations and how we can reimagine stations that are fit for the future, fit for the next generation and beyond. So those 3 ways of putting design at the heart to ensure that the connection between infrastructure and our passengers or humans is clear.
Brilliant, thank you, Anthony. Definitely come back to the kind of the how-to for some reflections that Judith and Anthony sort of picked up about sort of approaches, bottom-up, top-down. Peter, over to you, please.
Thank you, Sue. So Peter Elliott, I am Head of Property Development at TfL. And let me just set out a couple of words of context as to what we do and why design is important. TfL has quite a significant landholding within London, about 5,000 acres within and around the M25. We're also part of the Merrill family. So we have a number of different, often competing objectives, but principally we're trying to lever against that landholding to bring about an increase of housing for London in a way that doesn't negatively impact the transport network, and indeed instances where it increases and enhances that network are frequent. But also there's a commercial reality to it, helping to reinvest in the buses and the trains in order to keep the lights on. Now, design within that is absolutely crucial. It can't be just a commercial exercise. We won't gain planning permission, and indeed the sustainability, and I mean longevity as well as the ecological aspects of that, just won't hold true in the long term. So in order to do this, we've expanded the team, and how seriously we're taking this is evident. 5 years ago we were 5 strong. Now we're about 100 people strong in terms of delivering about 10,000 homes for London. In order to maintain that design, those design quality and standards, we've brought in a design quality team. So that's run by 4 or 5 individuals that oversee the minutiae involved within our schemes. And indeed, the level of control that we take within these projects is also key to maintaining that. We often step into joint ventures and are therefore equity partners, as opposed to simply selling a site and losing control of the ultimate delivery. We've also set ourselves, as Anthony's been saying, we've been doing something fairly similar. We set ourselves a design ethos with 6 principles within it that we want all of our projects to comply with, but then also putting documents of, and we call these our license to operate. We're obviously a public authority. We need to be bringing about the best practice in the industry. So those documents really describe our community engagement. We need to make sure that we aren't just bringing about a solution for Northwood that's exactly the same as Peckham. We need to recognize the idiosyncrasies of those different locations. We're looking at the heritage aspects of our sites. We're looking at the placemaking aspects, and those have become incredibly pertinent within the COVID environment, such as retail, such as public realm, commercial, education, health and well-being. All of those aspects need to be ingrained within our long-term vision for a particular site. And then as we step into the actual application of this, we've been fairly engaged with, or actually very engaged with the GLA's mayoral design advocacy program. So we've hived off a transport cohort, not formally, but we use a smaller cohort of the MDAs in order to put together a design review process that is in 3 stages, that also includes design reviews by the local authority and the GLA. And then lastly, in order for us to maintain those standards as we go through and complete these 57 projects, we obviously have a monitoring and evaluation process to say what's gone well, what's gone badly, what can we improve, and therefore a feedback loop into some of the emerging projects that are just coming out of the ground, or indeed coming out of concept. So design is absolutely crucial in order to hit our overarching objectives.
Thank you, Peter. And lastly, could I turn to Sir Peter to tell us a bit about yourself, what about Network Rail, and your take on putting design at the centre.
So thanks, Sue, and thank you for chairing it, and thanks to the NLA, good friends. So at the very highest level, transport is seldom an end in itself. The purpose of connectivity is to create economic growth, jobs, housing, and social cohesion. And it's also an experience for the people who use it, either occasionally or every day. And many people will know on the call, I ran Transport for London as the commissioner for 9.5 years, and TfL has got a long history. The current slogan is "Every journey matters," and I think TfL well understands and has understood for generations the importance of making the experience of travel comfortable and pleasurable and easy. And what I found at TfL was that it wasn't too difficult to advocate good design, because the place had such a great history of fantastic architecture, and the legacy of fitness of purpose, that people generally, with some terrible exceptions, didn't do bad things because it had an ethos of designing things well for passengers. And it was a great pleasure to be there, and I still miss it for that ethos. So when I got to Network Rail, Britain's railways have been balkanised, and they were balkanised nearly 30 years ago. And Network Rail is the owner. It's probably got more assets than anybody else in Britain and has a huge land holding. But all my predecessors and those of Andrew Haynes, who's the chief executive, thought it was an engineering company. And they were all wrong. It's not an engineering company. It's a customer service company that looks after lots of passengers and freight and operates the railway, and probably has the extreme misfortune to own a vast collection of assets in various sorts of conditions, but also the great fortune to own some fantastic assets, which everybody is proud of, and we're just currently the custodians of. If you're the proprietor of Paddington Station, or Liverpool Street or King's Cross, then you're looking after something of enormous public consequence, and you should look after it really well. So Andrew and I are very lucky, and we're lucky to work with each other. Andrew is passionate about architecture, and I'm pretty passionate about design. And we've made Anthony's life an absolute misery by elevating his position from a backwater to the front of the organisation, which is where it should be. And we want to remedy some of the mistakes of the past and actually care about our built environment and the physical environment for people who use the railway in a way that hasn't always been done. Anthony's one arm of that. Another is our own passion for telling people that what they're doing in engineering terms isn't good enough, which Andrew does quite a lot of, and I do a bit of. We've got the Railway Heritage Trust to whom we give well over £1 million a year, who actually seek to reuse railway buildings, many of which were built 150 or more years ago and are still fit for purpose if we can find a purpose for them. And those are all great things to do. Anthony is a good advocate for the detail. I hope Andrew and I are good advocates for the principles of this. And it extends beyond buildings. So when I was at TfL, I got John Hunter, the design manager, to give the Johnson font, which is not only the lettering for TfL, it's actually the lettering for London. John gave it an update for its 100th anniversary, and I'm really proud that Anthony has with us got Margaret Calvert to revive the rail alphabet. If you could go to the Design Museum, there's an exhibition about Margaret's work, and the rail alphabet is part of it. And hopefully, Anthony, very shortly, we're going to start re-signing stations in lettering that's both familiar and can be seen from a distance, unlike the stuff that we use at the moment. And hopefully we can start to return the railway to feeling comfortable and looking good for the people who use it. Well, just one more slightly separate thing, but on the same subject, which is, of course, our stations are empty, the trains are empty, and it's very sad to be running a system with so few people on it, but that's inevitable because of COVID. It's probably not for today, but actually, I think that predictions about the collapse of mass transit are wrong. And you've only got to see why my former colleagues in TfL still have sent me throughout the pandemic what's going on London's transport, as well as, of course, I know what's going on the railway. And actually, when public transport usage in London was at 30 or 40%, road traffic volumes were over 90%. And you've only got to think about that to see that actually mass transit is inevitably something of the future. Clearly, it will take time to come back, and people's working conditions might have changed, though actually, I don't know. I bet most of the people on this call, the novelty of working from home or actually living at work has long since worn off. And I think people will be back. They may not be back in the same quantities, but actually the railway and mass transit in general are very adaptable. So, and actually we all badly want to go out. So the work that Anthony's doing, the work that we're doing, the work that Peter and his colleagues are doing at TfL is all still going to be valuable, because you can't envisage our urban places and cities full of traffic but not mass transit. It just won't work, and I think the pandemic's proved it. Thanks, Sue.
Thank you, Peter. I think amazing responses from you all there. And I think design is such a complex thing, but the joy and the simplicity of well-designed stations and, you know, aspects of iconography, if you like, in terms of TfL signage, fonts, post boxes, the first zebra crossing, Mary. I think, you know, I think all of those things are amazingly important to individuals, customers, as being things that they can recognise as design. But just one thing, and we are getting some questions in now, but one thing from me is, clearly we're talking to people who kind of understand and value design, and there are various different secrets to success, if you like, that you've all illustrated in the work that you're doing, whether it's design quality teams or principles and standards, design guides, you know, working with design review panels, whether it's GLA advocates or design council or other people that do design reviews, evaluation, multidisciplinary teams. So there's pushing on those aspects of success. But we also know as practitioners and people that work in various aspects that there are also shocking examples of and big chunky organisations that still don't accept or work with or understand the value. So what do we think of still the barriers to, you know, getting this message across that we are all, you know, super advocates of and can see the benefits in terms of wider determinants of health, biodiversity, climate, as well as the joy of passing a well-designed road sign or pedestrian crossing or small train station? If I can ask Mary, if I ask you to sort of kick off with that.
Thanks.
Is it government? Is it legislative?
Yeah, it is.
You know?
I think it is. I mean, for those of you who don't know, I was an MP for 15 years in Wakefield, and I was reflecting as Peter and Anthony were talking about the two projects I was involved with there. The redevelopment of Wakefield Westgate Station, brilliant, sort of from the ground up, brilliantly designed, black tiles to reference the proud coal mining tradition of the area, really interesting windows to sort of reference the sculptural traditions of Barbara Hepworth and Henry Moore, and the sculpture park and the Hepworth Gallery in the city. So fantastic design. And at the same time, the Kergate Station, which was the worst railway station in Britain, an absolute magnet for violent crime, serious crimes, and took the best part of, I think, £13 million to bring that up to scratch. And again, a very different and positive experience. But each of those, certainly the Kergate refresh, if you like, a heritage building, took the best part of, you know, 8 or 9 years just to get it to kind of project start. And it was one of those great things, whereas the local elected representative, I had the benefit of just being there and every year calling all the partners together and banging heads together to make sure it happened. I think where both projects fell down was on what happens when you leave the station, because there's no signage for pedestrians. So I would get off the train every sort of Thursday night, Friday morning, and find people wandering around asking, where is the city? And the sort of very, you know, so it's really very basic sort of those micro level things that I was talking about. You mentioned the pedestrian crossing. We have groups, you know, to put in your kind of dropped curb and your zebra crossing is the thick end of £40,000. Now there's a whole kind of argument about, could we simplify zebra crossings? Could we remove the beacons? Can we remove the traffic management order, or all the difficulties around that? Because there's a whole bureaucracy and advertising issue around streets and roads and road transport, and so that we get more safe places for people to cross. And then you get back into the kind of, well, you know, how do we alert visually impaired people that that there is a crossing ahead. You know, we don't want, you know, how do we put pedestrians at the top of the transport hierarchy instead of cars, so that once the pedestrians set foot on the crossing, the car has to stop. And all of those changes which are in place, you know, banning pavement parking outside London because it's banned currently in London, and the pedestrian at the top of the highway code, they're all in place, but they're all subject to a great deal of controversy. And similarly with the design guidance, I want also on pavements, cutting the clutter, one of our big campaigns for this year. A-boards, theoretically banned, but in practice they're everywhere. Bike parking. I was looking at one of the questions, you know, the hospital that thinks that bike parking is ugly, but it's, you know, they'll have a massive car park of 1,000 spaces. They're perfectly fine because they're all shiny, clean and new. And the issue around electric vehicles charging. So we're seeing pavements already not fit for social distancing and already have overspill of people walking in the roads, now being given over to car infrastructure. Why is that not part of the road space reallocation? And the answer is because you need a traffic management order. It's more expensive. So let's just do the easy thing and steal more space from pedestrians. And we've got to, I think it's very hard for traffic engineers because they've been trained to design for transport flow, and that's all that matters. And what we're asking them to do is now to design for health, for beauty, for active travel. And it's very, very challenging, I think. And, you know, and I think kind of the training and investment in those skills is probably not there and is still emerging.
Thank you, Mary. I think given that we're talking about traffic orders, that might be a point for Peter to come in from TfL, but also from the design aspect in terms of Judith. If there's any reflections on that and barriers and how we can get over that, let's have something from Judith and Peter on that. And then we have got some really good questions, which I'll come to in the chat. So Peter, Judith, do you want to come back to Mary on traffic orders?
Could I just take the barriers first of all? And I think this is actually quite an important point. And it's no, you know, there's no realization, there's no epiphany here. I think the design world and expertise have been telling us this for a long time. They've been really saying step outside the red line boundary. And whereas our first 10,000 homes were very, very distinct sites that had a red line boundary, as we now look towards the next 37 or 40,000 homes within London, we're very much looking at the collaboration between ourselves and the neighbouring landowners. And let me tell you why that's important. The additionality that is brought about by bringing sites together, and the importance is actually the space in between buildings, not necessarily the buildings themselves, but the additionality that well-designed public realm, the integration of the transport network, biophilic design, a lot of what Mary's just been talking about is exactly the premise of, or the origin of what we start to look at in places like Edgware, really designing new town centres. It creates a virtuous circle. It means that if we can create a place that is legible, that is comfortable, where people want to dwell and want to go and spend time within the ground floor accommodation, whether that's retail, whether that's commercial, whether that is leisure or indeed assembly. It means that it's a place where people also want to live and work. It becomes a self-sustaining location that in turn drives value, whether that's happened to be the rental role of the retail units or indeed an extra £5 per square foot on the residential above it. But it also means that people can then access the transport node and the transport modes as easily as possible. It becomes a self-fulfilling exercise. And that's really where we are looking to head over the next medium and long term, and therefore really drive as much benefit to London as possible, just stepping outside the red line boundary.
Thank you, Peter. Judith, barriers, secrets for success, responses?
It's difficult to answer that question without sort of an outpouring of frustration of years of practice in this area. But actually, it's not just my view. We've just done a survey of the members of the institutional and civil engineers and what those barriers were in terms of delivering the NIC design principles, and things coming out of that. To Mary's point about training and skills, people don't have carbon literacy. They don't know how to engage with people, talk to sort of different perspectives. You know, what is biodiversity net gain? A lot of education around that. What was also coming out of it is the fact that the business models, procurement methods also don't support an outcomes-based approach. But perhaps one of the biggest things coming out of that survey was that it's not in the brief to start. So, you know, the work that Anthony and Peter are doing at Network Rail is fantastic, but we need more of that. So clients who really are invested in a really good design brief that is holistic. So it does also come back to government. And I think also one of the things that we've been talking about as a practice as well, our observations about how different parts of the infrastructure community operate by virtue of the way in which they're set up. So they're naturally inclined to sort of siloed working. So I think that's where you need to tackle systemic change to get those outcomes. And I think just the last thing, whilst it's brilliant that the government green book is going to be updated, it really does need to influence decisions. It's not just, you can't just do the maths behind it. It has to influence your decision-making process.
Brilliant, thank you, Judith. And I think aspects around barriers and skills and knowledge, we're doing some work with the Centre for Digital Build Britain at the moment about sort of how we work with graduates. And I think, you know, looking at the next generation of people coming in, multidisciplinary work, I think there's a big part to play in our higher education establishments about more multidisciplinary aspects around the built environment so that we learn from each other and not work in silos. And certainly there's definitely a role, I think, for maybe it's this office for place in terms of how we sort of share skills and competencies to local authorities as well as to other member organisations. Some great questions in the chat. So I'm going to kick off with a couple now, and then we'll see who wants to grab some of these questions, some specifically for Network Rail. But because Judith mentioned it, there is one around procurement, if I can just find it. So design competitions and standards are a great way to raise the bar for design. But what about procurement models? Are they undergoing similar transformation to ensure design is weighted appropriately compared to cost and the usual race to the bottom? And I have to say, a personal interest in that, in being a kind of small charity, and a lot of infrastructure clients have a number of, you know, big chunky organisations that are always on frameworks. So let's get into that one, shall we? Lots of vigorous nodding. Maybe, Sir Peter, can I ask you to kick us off?
Well, I think it's a really good question, and actually, if you run one of these vast organisations like Network Rail, or for that matter TfL, you're always subject to people in some procurement process torpedoing the best intentions by putting in conditions in tenders that prevent small and innovative people giving you their ideas, and I've had to intervene in both organisations sometimes to stop procurement outcomes that look perfect from a process point of view but produce the wrong answer from the outcome point of view. And there is work to do. I'm hoping that Anthony will come in and tell me that some of it's on its way, and Andrew and I have both intervened to try and appropriate cases to make sure that we do bring in people who aren't mammoth consultancies and organisations, because big organisations like to deal with big organisations because it's all very comfortable and everybody conforms with the rules. So it's a very fair point. And I've come to the conclusion at the age of 67 that it's like painting the fourth bridge. You've got to keep going on this, because as fast as you change the rules to let one set of people in, somebody else aggregates a vast amount of services together and puts out some tender that can only be applied for by people with multi-million-pound turnovers. Go on, Anthony, tell me something's happening in the right direction.
Yeah, I was keen to jump in on this one because yeah, procurement is a theme that yeah comes up on a almost hourly basis with my team about one of the challenges that we have, and I think procurement is very similar to the question about what are the barriers. And I would say that there are 4 key areas to barriers or procurement, and the first I would stress about having leadership. So yeah, I'm well tuned now to Sir Peter or Andrew Haynes emailing me often late on a Friday night or early on a Saturday morning about things that they've seen that they're not happy with. So having very strong design champions at the top of the organisation makes a significant difference. That was one of the recommendations from the National Infrastructure Commission, and the government made that recommendation in significant projects at the back end of last year. So leadership is key. Process, which strongly links to the procurement bit, and process is a challenge, but I do believe that the work that we're doing in relation to the design guidance, the design manuals, it helps to provide what is the specification. So what do we actually want? And as a client organisation, we have a very key role to set an aspiration in the brief. And Judith mentioned about setting a clear, aspiring brief. That is a very key role for a client to do. And what does good look like? The client has a key role in that area. Culture, I think, is another very important part on both procurement and the barriers. And having a design culture within an organisation. And we've discussed about how some of that may have got lost historically in mainline railway organisations, but we're now trying to bring it back and reset that. And I think there's also an opportunity to think different. So the way that the work that we've done with the RRBA with the recent station competition, included within that, I hope we've set a very aspiring brief to reimagine railway stations. We've got a 3-stage approach to that. And at the end of it, the procurement, we worked really hard, and I spent more time with procurement lawyers than I care to think about, to allow the end of the competition for a complete line of sight. So the winners of the competition, we will be able to engage with directly to do a site-specific rollout of those designs. So thinking differently about how we approach procurement is important. And then the 4th area, and I suppose this applies to all of infrastructure, is about the complexity of it. So the technical complexity of infrastructure, and how considering that in the brief is very important to ensure that we get the right procurement outcomes.
Brilliant, thank you. I have got some other really excellent questions, and there's one that's going to engage all of you, I'm sure. The development of station car parks, thinking about land value here, has been identified as a key feature to releasing land for homes. Has there been any design guides produced on this, and will station car parking be a thing of the past? That's close to TfL's heart and also to Network Rail in terms of all those assets that you have. But also from the perspective of Mary and Judith from a practitioner, but also from somebody responsible for people that have to get from A to B and how we want to promote active travel. Great question. So who would like to kick off answering this one?
Could I kick off just very quickly?
Yeah.
Just from a Network Rail perspective, we've got a design guidance in development at the moment for what we're calling third-party car parking. So where we've got third-party funded car parking schemes. We've also got some very early work at some design guidance looking at mobility. So not thinking of car parking as car parking as one element of mobility within stations. So something we're actively looking at, quite a long way through, working with a number of external parties, as I mentioned, in that externally collaborative way. So it'll be interesting to discuss with whoever raised the question. Maybe if I can get their contact details through the NLA, that would be great.
Anybody else want to pick up on that?
I certainly can.
If I take Peter and then Judith.
Super. Thank you, Sue. 2 minutes on this. The TfL car parks program, or indeed portfolio, in terms of developing housing, has been fairly key. I think we've looked at or promoted 19 sites that we're looking to develop upon. But in terms of their role to play within the transport modality, we've always looked at where the cars are coming from in regards to who's parking in that particular car park. In a lot of instances, particularly within the outer London areas, there are a lot of cars that actually are traveling fair distances to get there. Those cars are looking to take advantage of the cheap rates of TfL car parking spaces, but actually what they are doing is contributing towards congestion and poor air quality within those particular towns and satellite locations around London. So we're looking at different ways as to how we can solve that problem, but also very aware of the fact that the car parks invariably are sat immediately adjacent to transport nodes, and therefore comply with, well, actually the London Plan and other documents suggest that that's exactly where accessible housing ought to be built. So there is a contradictory nature to the car parking, the use of it, the attraction of it, depending upon which part of the society you happen to represent.
Judith, do you want to come back?
Yeah, just very quickly, this is one of the projects that we've been looking at through the Velocity lens. There's a danger that one of the local stations becomes a car park and a park and ride station. So what we've been looking at is, and the reason that that's happening is because it's safer to drive. The cycling and walking routes to that station are so poor that people don't feel, it's country lanes, and that's the the Velocity approach, which is about trying to find safer routes and more of a mixed mobility approach, as Anthony said, to those stations is critical.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move us on to another really cracking question. Good to hear about and to be involved in the drive to improve design in transport. With the different sets of guidance, standards and advice being developed across a number of organisations and devolved authorities, is there a risk that we will end up with an overall network that is inconsistent and confusing? How can we ensure the consistency and coherency across transport and the built environment is delivered on the ground to improve the overall experience of people? And I think this is, I'm also very mindful of that as a sort of coming from Design Council, who work with a number of clients to develop design standards, principles, frameworks that we, so we have got a lot of them out there. What do you think is the trick here about trying to sort of have an overarching opportunity to sort of look at a set of guidance? Don't want to have one size fits all, because we have regionality and devolved nations, and there is differences, but there must be some standards that are applicable. Mary, you put your hand up.
I think we already have that. So as somebody who lived effectively in two cities for 15 years, people would always say to me, oh, you're so brave cycling in London. And I would always say, yeah, but I'm cycling through a 20-mile-an-hour neighbourhood until I get down to a segregated cycleway down near Smithfield and Blackfriars. And then I'm going to the House of Commons for 2 miles next to very busy roads, but essentially super fast and only a couple of little traffic lights. So, whereas in Wakefield, I lived a mile from the city centre in one of those urban sprawl, 4-bedroom houses with off-space, off-road parking for 2 cars, because that's what the developers told me I wanted and needed, and where there was literally no safe way to cycle into my office, which was under a mile away, because I was on an A road. It was simply, there was a little footpath and then I was thrust out into the traffic, and no segregation, but a kind of shared pedestrian and cycleway with no signage. So the pedestrians weren't aware it was a shared space. It was just me and the transport engineers at Wakefield Council that were aware, because I'd looked at the maps. So it's one of these things where you just, it already happens. And I think there's this bit about government not being joined up. The Department for Communities and Local Government sets one set of standards, Department for Transport sets another, Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs is looking after air quality, and they're all setting different kind of things, and we kind of know what we have to do. So I suppose my answer to the question is we need certainly to be designing our buildings. At the moment, there is nothing to stop a building being designed for overheating, and we are building buildings now that go to 40 and 50 degrees and have to be shut in heat waves. So we're not building climate resilient buildings, and that means we're not building climate resilient cities at a time when we know it might not feel like it now, when the climate is going to get hotter and our average temperatures are going to rise. So we know we have to do that. We know that we also have to give more space to people. We think that probably following COVID and the sort of disaster in the kind of shopping and shops area, that there will be more people living in cities. So I think we're on the cusp of a very exciting time where the 20-minute neighborhood, the 5-minute neighborhood, whatever you want to call it, is going to become more normalized wherever you live. And I think that means that we ought to be looking at no more out of town shopping centres where you induce traffic demand and where you simply can't walk to them because they're on the M62 or wherever they are, the M1, where you look at, local initiatives around schools. That we've got schools in Wales where parents sign up to not use the car. And you do it at the moment of maximum desire where they want to get their kid into that school and they say, well, we're a car-free school. Oh yeah, I'll sign on the dotted line. Then you go out and find the parents when they turn up late and park on the zigzags. There's some really interesting things that you can do on the micro level as well as on the macro level to change behaviour, to nudge people into doing it, to close the streets to traffic when at pick up and drop off times, so you simply can't park there. And I sort of think there's something around the car parking issue that is really interesting, because we had just going back to those two stations, both were built with brand new car parks at a time when we were ripping down a hideous 1970s concrete car park in the city centre. What did we replace it with in Wakefield? A brand new car park. Such a missed opportunity.
Thank you. I think we've actually got 2 minutes. That's flown by that time. So thank you so much for a fantastic discussion. And I think the takeaways here for me are, we kind of know what the barriers are. We know what steps we need to put in place to make these things happen. But I think picking up on Mary's last point about how we communicate, tell stories effectively, and influence change behaviour, whether it's nudge behaviour, whether it's more sort of punitive in terms of putting stickers or bumpers on those cars that park on the zigzags. But there's that granular and top-down approach, and I think there's lots of lessons to be learned from design champions and making it happen from within. And I think Network Rail and TfL are a good example of those kind of good principles being sort of shown in reality. So we have come to an end, sadly. I think the questions that are in the boxes, don't fear those who've asked them if they're not going to get an answer. We can come back to panel members for a response. Please hang on the line, those of you who are still there, so that you can fill in the online survey. It helps NLA improve performance going forward. And a huge thank you from me to all the panel members for fantastically rich and diverse conversation this morning. I hope you'll stay warm. And I think we are going to come to a close shortly. Okay, thank you very much.